All right, awesome. Welcome, everybody. So today is our second noon webinar series. So let's see. Again, just a reminder, tag yourself as you go on this journey to become a Master Gardener volunteer, either on Twitter or on Facebook. Thanks for all of you who've shared pictures or what you're excited about each week. And I just wanted to take a moment to talk about, to just kind of define what it is that volunteer service is. So you're going through the Master Gardener training, which is preparing you to be a volunteer in your community. And so just a few ways of thinking about that volunteer service. One is that it's volunteering, so it's unpaid. It's not a part of your job. The second is that you're part of this international volunteer network. And I'm pretty sure that the Master Gardener program is one of the largest volunteer networks in the country. So you're part of this big network and you're a volunteer who's representing Iowa State University Extension and Outreach. So we're really glad to have you on board representing us. We've got over 2,000 active Master Gardener volunteers and our program is 40 years old. And the third part is that we have an emphasis on gardening. So whether you love insects, and maybe that's something you just discovered after hearing from Donald, or maybe milkweed is your thing, you're in the right place. So some Master Gardener volunteers are tending pollinator gardens at parks. Others are providing virtual workshops to the community. And then the fourth part is that this volunteer service is taking place in public spaces. So maybe you've seen Master Gardener volunteers at the farmer's market answering questions, or maybe you know of somebody who's working at a school garden, preparing gorgeous gardens at county or even the state fairgrounds, libraries, Main Street, community gardens. So these are just a few of the many places where Master Gardener volunteers do their volunteer service. And I also wanted to highlight one project that's been going on for about 5 years, and Master Gardener volunteers have been doing donation gardening before this, but this is when we started to put some funding behind it. So it's called the Growing Together Project, and it's focused on Master Gardener volunteers that are either cultivating donation gardens, or they're encouraging their neighbors to plant an extra row. And they're the person who's connecting those gardeners with food pantries. And this program started in 2016 that we started offering mini grants to ISU Extension and Outreach county offices for these projects. So the money went to buy bins to harvest the food into. Maybe it was for buying seeds or buying plants. Some have even created orchards. So shout out to Black Hawk County, where part of their Growing Together project was setting up an orchard. And a quarter of Iowa counties are currently participating in this program. So feel free to find out from your county ISU Extension and Outreach Master Gardener coordinator if your county has ever been a part of this, because it's a really cool program that has a big impact. So last year, 115,000 pounds of produce were donated to food pantries. And these mini grant applications are opening up in November, and they'll be due in January. So there'll be more details coming out in our newsletter. So this is where you could find more information about the Growing Together project. And this is the Master Gardener website, so feel free to check it out. I know you've been doing a lot of online learning, but if you need more, we've got some webinars listed for this month, and 2 of them on this Saturday morning and the following Saturday morning are offered by Cindy, and those are looking really good. And another shout out, this is a super cool website that Cindy manages. So this is the Horticulture and Home Pest newsletter. Donald mentioned it last week, and some of the Q&A that came in, this is where I sent people, because this is my #1 go-to place. If I have a question, I type something in the search box, I look at the frequently asked questions. It's an incredible resource. So that's a really great place to go. So next week will be the third webinar, and that's focused on animal ecology. And so you'll need to complete that lecture video before attending, and that'll be Dr. Adam Janke. And yeah, so with that, I wanted to turn it over to Cindy. And let's see, Cindy, do you think we can share your slides and unmute you?
Let me unmute me first.
Yay.
And I can share my screen, right?
I hope so.
How's that? Can you see it?
I can't see it yet. Oh, there it's coming. Awesome. Yay, so I'll hand it over to you, Cindy, and I'll do my best to watch the chat box and start looking for some of those Q&As, because I bet there's lots of good stuff coming in.
I hope there's some good Q&As. I also hope there's some polling questions that work. So thank you very much, Susan. Thanks also very much for talking a little bit about Gardening in the Air, which is a virtual gardening symposium happening this Saturday and next Saturday. And if you go to the Hort and Home Pest News webpage, you can find out more information. It's a thing I'm working with, a symposium I'm working with Illinois Extension. So it's Illinois Master Gardeners with Iowa Master Gardeners and whoever else is interested. But today, my main focus is a class on campus that Richard Geron and I usually do. It's focused on botany and how we identify plants. So this class on campus may not be as much fun because we're not looking at flowers, we're not dissecting flowers, we're not keying out leaves to different trees, but I think you can get the concept. And then I hope at the end of this webinar, you go outside, you start to look at some of the leaves on the trees and figure some of this stuff out so you can start identifying plants. And that's the primary objective for today, is to talk about flower parts, talk about the parts of a leaf, use some of those vocabulary terms that we use to describe different parts of a flower or leaf morphology. So at the end, you can use these skills so that you know some of the terms, or at least know where to look it up, so that you can then go identify some of the plants in your landscape. I think the first thing we want to do, though, before this, Susan, is can we do that polling question about how comfortable they are with plant identification? Yes, there we go. So first I'm going to ask you this question at the beginning and the end, see if there's a change. How comfortable are you at identifying plants? And Susan, you'll have to be in charge. I don't know how many have answered.
Sure. It looks like some of those people that are super confident, so some of those people that are super confident, they took a while to respond. So let's see, I'm ending the polling and I'm sharing the results. So it looks like most people are in the middle.
Excellent. So having that knowledge, just a little bit of that knowledge, can really get us started and get us going and getting us to the next level. I can do this so that you can get it right most of the time.
And I bet we have some people who are in that third category, but just don't identify that way.
Well, everybody needs help. So on some instances, there are plants that even I don't know that we send off to Deb Lewis and the herbarium, or a weed specialist, or whoever. So we always find those experts that help us out too.
And cool. Apologies, I stopped your share, so you'll need to re-share your screen.
Oh, share screen. There we go. Do you see it now? I think we must.
That's great. Yep.
Thank you. So after that, so plants are identified, or they're categorized primarily by their flowers and the fruit that they create. So knowing a little something about flower morphology and fruit morphology can really help in identifying plants. We also use leaves because leaves are distinctive, and leaves are usually there most of the growing season, where flowers may or may not be there. But just so you know that there's incredible range of diversity in flowers, just like there's an incredible range in the diversity of leaves. These are just some of the illustrations of the different possible inflorescence types, so that every circle here is a different flower or a type of flower. So it gets overwhelming and confusing, but what I want you to know is that regardless of the inflorescent types, there are usually certain parts to a flower. And you probably did this in elementary school, or certainly in biology in high school. You looked at the different parts of a flower. Flowers are arranged in whorls. The outer whorl is usually the sepal, which is this little green piece at the bottom, looks like little leaves. The next whorl in are the petals. They're usually the showy part of the flower. The next whorl in from that are what we call the stamen, which is the anther supported by the filament. So that's where the pollen is, the male part of the flower. And then the center whorl is the female part of the flower called the pistil, usually, which is the stigma, which is the sticky surface where the pollen lands. It goes down the style into the ovary, which develops into the fruit. So this is a great example of a perfect flower. Oops. And here's a picture of what that would look like kind of in real life. Plants don't always read our books, and they don't always follow our guidelines, so there's always exceptions to this. But flowers are there to attract the attention of a pollinator, so that they can be fertilized and produce fruit or seed. So the purpose is something we enjoy as well, because they're beautiful. And with this lily, you see the same thing, the pistil and the stamen. The pistil is the female parts in the center. The stamen is the anther and the filaments, or the male parts. And then the surrounding petals for this particular flower illustration or picture, the petals and the sepals look alike. And that's one of the first terms that may be new to you, is something called tepals. So when you can't distinguish between the petals and the sepals, we call them tepals. The outer whorl, if you were to pull these off one by one, would be the sepals. The inner ones would be the petals. And on the class on campus, this would be one of the things we were doing, would be pulling off different parts of the flower so that we could dissect and see something just like this. Another thing that we would do in the class on campus is we would look at how the ovary is positioned in comparison to those sepals, or where the sepals and the petals emerge from. If it's sitting on top of the sepals and the petals, it's called a superior ovary. If it's sitting entirely below, it's called an inferior ovary. And if it's halfway in between, it's called a half inferior ovary. This seems a little weird. Why would we want to know this? But in identifying different plants by the flowers, sometimes this is a really helpful guide, or one of those keys that we use in identifying different types of flowers or different plants, species of plants. So it's called ovary position. It's not quite as simplistic as this drawing makes it out to be, but you will notice that some plants have a superior ovary and some produce distinctly inferior or half inferior ovaries. So look at flowers a little closer next time. It's kind of cool. If we cut into the ovary, we're actually looking at the chambers, or the carpels. Sometimes they're called the carpels. And then we're looking at something called the ovules, which are going to develop into the seed. And if we really get into this, you would have a magnifying glass, you would look at this, you would count the ovules, or how many ovules per chamber, and that also helps you identify to a certain species there as well. Sometimes there's very few, and sometimes there's loads. So usually if it's more than a dozen, we just put a dozen plus. Other times it's only 1 or 2 or 3 in each chamber. For the class on campus, what we would have dissected are snapdragons and gladiolas. So these are easy to find and something that you can get on your next trip to the grocery store. Probably would have some of these flowers. It's certainly at some point in the year. The snapdragon's kind of unique because the petals are fused to form that kind of snap-like habit. If you pull the petals apart, each lobe of that petal or that flower was a petal that was fused together. And if you pull it apart, you will see the bright pollen, the bright yellow pollen on 4 stamens. And then you would see this one stigma in the center that has a couple, or has an ovary with a couple of carpels below. It's kind of cool. This snapdragon distinctly has sepals, which is also very interesting, that look like little green appendages at the base of the flower. The gladiola is a little different. This is actually pretty easy to dissect as well. This one is another one that has tepals because the sepals and the petals look a lot alike. The outer whorl is the sepals, the inner whorl is the petals. The stamen or the anther and the filament are very prominent and usually kind of an orangey brown color. And then the stigma is a little different on a gladiola because it's one pistil, but the stigma tip is branched, so into 3 parts. So it really maximizes its ability to capture any of that pollen. And this one has more of an inferior ovary, so because the petals and the sepals sit above the ovary, so a slightly different ovary position. So those are some clues on how to identify different parts of perfect flowers. And when we talk about botany and flower parts, a lot of flowers are perfect. They have both male and female parts. But there are some instances out there of imperfect flowers. So when a flower has all 4 whorls, it is considered complete and perfect. And when it's missing one of those 4 whorls, it is incomplete. And if it's missing the male or female part, then it's called imperfect. So instantly when one of those 4 whorls, the sepals or petals or the stamens or the pistils are missing, it's incomplete. And if the stamens and the pistils are missing, it's also immediately imperfect. So in the chat box, and Susan, you'll have to monitor this, if you could tell me what C, that imperfect flower C, what is it missing? What part is it missing? What makes it incomplete and imperfect? And Susan, you can just tell us some of the answers on, if you unmute yourself maybe. Uh-oh.
Sure, yeah, I'm just watching them come in.
Okay. So what part is missing in C?
I see some people saying anther, some people saying stamen, some people saying male parts.
Excellent. All 3 of those answers are correct. We are missing the stamens, we are missing the anthers which house the pollen, so we're missing the male part. So that flower C would be called a pistillate flower because it's all female. The flower in the center, that imperfect flower in the center, is a staminate flower because it's all male. This is important in knowing something about imperfect flowers because this ensures that the plant gets cross-pollinated. So it can't create its pollen, right? And then it hits its own surface. So it must be cross-pollinated, which is kind of a great, clever way to make sure that there's a bee nearby or wind or something that's helping cross-pollinate that particular plant. So that's the reason why imperfect flowers are there. And imperfect flowers can happen kind of in two ways. One is called monoecious plants, where these imperfect flowers are in separate structures on the same plant. So monoecious means one house. So if you look at the illustration here at the bottom, there's a male flower, there's a female flower, but they're on the same plant, so they're in one house. And then there's also dioecious plants, where there's different male and female flowers, but they're on different houses. So we have one plant that is entirely male and one plant that is entirely female, because all the flowers on that plant are either male or female. Kind of interesting. There's some advantages to each of these. Once again, they're imperfect flowers, so it requires some cross-pollination. Sometimes we like dioecious plants because they produce fruit or they don't produce fruit, depending on if we have male or female. So there's some kind of cool things that happen here. My guess is you probably know a few monoecious plants. You may or may not know the term, and it's a weird term, I know. But think about it. Do you know some monoecious plants that have imperfect flowers, male flowers and female flowers on the same plant? And Susan, if we could have that poll.
Sure, let me pull up the poll, and if you want to stop your screen share for a moment. And then we've
Okay.
also got a couple questions in the Q&A. So I just put up the poll.
Excellent.
Yeah, one person had a question about dissecting flowers such as Rudbeckia or coneflowers, because I think maybe that's a little bit harder to cut into. And then one person was wondering about blueberry bushes, and maybe that's why they need to cross-pollinate.
It is part of that. So sometimes they do need to cross-pollinate, and that may be one of the reasons. Sometimes there's a self-incompatibility issue too. So you can have perfect flowers that do not accept its own pollen. So, and I think a lot of the Ericaceae family, which is the rhododendron and blueberry, are more in that realm than having, you know, imperfect flowers. So there's multiple ways that plants do it. Sometimes there's a self-incompatibility, sometimes it's an imperfect flower forcing that cross-pollination. And
Cool.
as far as cutting into dissecting a Rudbeckia flower, this is a head, like a sunflower, so it's big, it's thick. I would slice it right in half and you will see all the little flowers on top. So that Rudbeckia or that coneflower has hundreds of flowers and little individual flowers on that stem, and only the outer flowers are ray flowers that produce a petal. So it's kind of cool. You might need a magnifying glass, but go and do it. It's a lot of fun.
You know what? I'm going to share this picture of a Rudbeckia because I'm one of those people that sometimes I don't know the name of a plant. So this is what we were talking about. So I'm
Yes.
going to stop the poll and share those results.
Oh, nice. See, I knew this was, you know, you grew up in Iowa, you live in Iowa. Of course, you know that corn is a monoecious plant. I want you to know that watermelon is a monoecious plant, and ginkgo. No, just watermelon is a monoecious plant. The others, holly, ginkgo, and asparagus, are dioecious. So all of these produce imperfect flowers, and corn and watermelon actually produce it on the same plant, and holly, ginkgo, and asparagus produce it on different plants, which is kind of fun.
And sorry for the watermelon misspelling. We were
Oh,
making some last minute polls, everybody. Sorry about that. Do you want
it's
to
okay.
grab your slides again?
Yep. There we go.
Awesome.
So good, you've got it. Here's some other examples of monoecious plants that are out there. So there's a lot of palms that are monoecious or dioecious. There's some that are dioecious as well. There's some nut trees that are monoecious as well, so they have in separate flower structures. And then melon and maize are some of the easiest for us to identify. This is important to know as a gardener because if we have a plant that's producing two different types of flowers, only one of those flowers has the ability to produce any fruit. So with squash, we often see a ton of flowers in the garden, but half of those are going to be male that have no ability to produce the squash that we want. So it's important to know, if you're counting all your eggs in one basket, that you know that you're counting the squash that are capable of producing that zucchini or that butternut or whatever it may be. If you look at the flowers carefully, you can tell. You can tell which ones are the male or which ones are the female. Look for the pollen if you're looking on the inside. The pollen is very distinctive in almost all staminate flowers. And then with squash and a lot of vine crops, they produce an immature fruit at the base of the flower, even before it's pollinated. So that little immature fruit tells you if that's a female flower, and this one is definitely a butternut squash. Or it can be a pumpkin or a little cucumber, whatever the case may be, which is kind of cool. Dioecious plants, a great example of this is holly. Holly berries are only produced on the female plant. The female has this little green basketball in the center, which is the ovary, a fairly large ovary, and you see no pollen in anything there. So the entire plant has nothing but female flowers, but because holly is kind of rare, it needs to make sure that it has a male plant nearby for cross-pollination. So when you're buying holly for the landscape, we're often selling you 3 or 4 or 5 females and making sure that there's at least 1 or 2 males that are sold as well, so that you have that pollen from the males and then you have fruit on all of the females. So kind of cool. Sometimes we don't want fruit, so asparagus, we often buy male cultivars so they don't produce fruit and don't waste any effort on it. Ginkgos, we like males because we don't want the stinky fruit of a ginkgo. So sometimes there's an advantage to having only male plants too. So that's it kind of for the flower piece about today. Let's talk a little bit more and switch gears to talking a little bit about leaves, because this is also how we identify plants. Some of this you know. So we'll start with something kind of easy. You probably know a little something about leaf arrangement. We'll also talk about simple versus compound leaves. We might even go in a little bit about leaf margins and leaf shapes. But first is leaf arrangement. So in a stem, there are often nodes, and all the leaves emerge from a node. And if there's one leaf at each node, and they usually alternate all the way up the stem, then it's usually considered alternate. If there are 2 leaves at a node, a lot like this maple in my office, okay, 2 leaves that emerge from that one node, then it's considered opposite because they're opposite each other, and they're usually opposite all the way up. And then sometimes there's more than 2 leaves per node, sometimes 3 to 5 leaves in a node, and then it's like a whorl, and we call it a whorled leaf arrangement. So in identifying trees, we often, the first step is identifying whether it's got an opposite or an alternate leaf arrangement. There's a ton that have an alternate leaf arrangement. There's fewer that have opposite leaf arrangements, which makes it pretty easy to kind of identify them, and even fewer still that have a whorled leaf arrangement. So once again in the chat, if you don't mind, just very quickly tell me which is the opposite leaf. Is it the one on the left or the one on the right? So that you're looking at. Which one is the oppositely arranged leaf?
Yeah, and we've got a lot coming in here. I see mostly right that people are saying.
You got it. You got it. So You can see those 2 leaves per node. They're opposite each other. Sometimes this is spiral, so they might be opposite each other this way, and then the next time opposite that way, which is kind of cool, making sure that it's full. That's great. You'll also notice when you're identifying trees, those nodes, that's where the branches emerge. That could also be where the flowers emerge. So those nodes have a lot going on. So it's kind of important to know how to identify the node and to see what's coming from it. So kind of cool. Excellent. I think you did well on that one. And that way I know you're still awake out there as well. So you know leaf arrangement. Now let's make sure you know a simple versus a compound leaf. So wherever that leaf is attached to the stem, everything beyond that bud or that node is considered the leaf. And sometimes leaves are very simple. They have a petiole and a blade, like the simple leaf example. Sometimes the leaves are more divided. So we call these compound leaves, and each one has a little leaflet. And sometimes that division gets very extensive. So here is a compound leaf I just took, or just collected from outside. This whole thing is a leaf, right from here all the way. So it must have 20 or 30 leaflets on it. So sometimes they can be quite large. So this whole thing is a Kentucky coffee tree leaf, which is a lot of fun. Okay. So,
Sorry, I brought us over to video so we could really see that Kentucky coffee tree
yes,
up close.
that's kind of a fun one. And I'm glad in another 2 weeks, all these leaves will be gone. So I'm glad this is scheduled for today.
Gone or in a different place?
Composted. Yeah.
All right.
Fallen off. Okay, so I need to share my screen again. So what I'm talking about is this, where the leaf connects to the stem is the bud. Everything beyond the bud is considered the leaf. So technically, those little things that look like leaves are leaflets. And they do have a petiole, and then there's a rachis in between them. This is a pinnately compound leaf, and you can see it's got 2, 4, 6, 7 leaflets. And this would be something like an ash, or maybe a hickory would be something like this one. Those leaflets can be arranged in all different manners. So you've probably seen a clover leaf. That's a trifoliate leaf arrangement with 3 leaflets. You may have seen a buckeye leaf, which has this palmately compound leaf. So each of the leaflets radiate like your fingers on your palm. So they come from a common point. Pinnately compound can be even or odd pinnate, depending on whether it has that terminal leaflet. So black walnut is a great example of an even pinnately compound leaf because it's missing that terminal one, whereas ash or hickory usually have it. And then, so you can see these different types of compound leaves. Still may have those leaf arrangements that we talked about on the stem, but everything beyond that stem, the leaves can also be incredibly unique. Knowing some of the terms also helps in identifying them in the next step. Leaf margins, I think this is the only slide I'm going to show you of leaf margins. I just want you to know that they vary. An entire leaf margin is smooth, and a serrate leaf margin has slight serrations on it, like a serrated knife. But do know that there are different types of serrations. Sometimes there's bristle tipped, sometimes there's doubly serrate, sometimes the serrations are rounded, and that's called crenate. We have a ton of vocabulary out there. You can look that up if you see a term that you need to know to double check something. Just know that there's lots of different types of serration, which are often very unique to the species of tree or shrub that you're trying to identify. And then leaf shapes. This is also something that usually helps us out a lot in identifying different plants. If this leaf shape is more rounded or oval, maybe with a heart-shaped leaf base like the one on the left, maybe the leaf is linear or grass-like. That's very distinctive. Maybe it's maple-like and lobed. And then the maple and the oak that you see are the two on the right, are both lobed leaves, but they're very different. The oak leaf is more deeply lobed, and then the maple leaf, the lobes are serrated. So the sinuses, which are inside those lobes, have serrations, whereas the oak leaf is entire. So knowing some of the terms helps you and be more confident when you're identifying the plants. And it's kind of cool to think about all the different leaf shapes that we have out there that we can see that might be changing colors. Sometimes this helps you get to species as well. So think about oaks. Just think about oaks, the diversity of oaks out there and how oak leaves vary. We have so many oaks that we have them divided into a white oak group members and red oak group members. And the biggest distinction between these two is not only the acorn and how long the acorn lasts, but how that lobe is rounded more on the white oaks and it's more pointed on the red oaks. So if you've got a black oak or northern pin oak or scarlet oak or red oak, you usually have these very pointed tips to the margins, where if you've got a white oak or a bur oak or swamp white oak, they tend to be more rounded. It's kind of cool. So you can do a lot just by looking at the leaves and even knowing that this is an oak. Here I know that I can pick this out, that this is a white oak group member or a red oak group member. So we've talked a lot about different types of leaves, simple leaves that are in the red bar, and then compound leaves, which can be incredibly diverse. So that Kentucky coffee tree leaf that I showed you is a bipinnately compound leaf. So it has two levels of before you actually see the leaflets. So it has that common rachis and then another rachis this way. So it's a lot like a honey locust, so bipinnately compound leaves. This generally means the leaflet's a little smaller. Not the case on Kentucky coffee tree, but certainly is the case with honey locust. So another good thing that I want to talk about in identifying these different types of leaves is how they can help you in very quickly identifying some plants in your landscape. So, Susan, we need that poll on the poison ivy. So
Got it.
which of these that you're seeing, is it the left one or the right one, is poison ivy?
All right. They're coming in. About over half of the people have voted, so I'll give it a little bit more time. But we have some really quick people here, Cindy.
Excellent. Well, this is one plant I want you to know. Before you leave today, make sure you know which one is poison ivy. That's important.
And this time of year, they're turning red. Is that right?
They can be red or yellow. Awesome.
Well, I think we have a winner.
We do have a winner, and neither one of these is correct.
What?
So it's a trick question.
Ooh.
It looks like the one on the left is poison ivy. However, do I need to go back and share my screen? No, I got it. That
Please
left
tell me you
one,
don't have poison ivy in your office, too.
I do not. Well, I can't tell you that. Hang on. So the one on the left was Boston ivy, which is another Parthenocissus. They were both a Parthenocissus that you were seeing. Virginia creeper looks a lot like poison ivy. It usually has 5 leaflets, but there is a version or a species of Parthenocissus that only produces 3. So the important thing is to remember is that not all 3 leaflet leaves are poison ivy, even though it does kind of look a little bit like it. And you might have to use a little bit more than just the leaf to identify it. And in this case, having a leaf isn't enough. You would probably want to look at the vine itself, because Virginia creeper or Boston ivy really affixes itself very well to a building and has these little cement holdfast. Whereas poison ivy has these kind of tendril-like roots that work a little bit differently. So you can see the picture of the poison ivy on the far right, and then the other two were actually a type of Parthenocissus, Virginia creeper, or Boston ivy. All three of these plants have beautiful fall color. So even poison ivy, that sometimes makes it easier to identify. So another poll, and I'll be legit this time. One of these is poison ivy. So is it the one on the left or the right? And then I'll show you what 3-leaflet leaf I have in my office.
I wonder if people are less inclined to answer because they're like, last time was a trick.
I know, last time was a trick question. So I do occasionally the trick questions, but this one there's no trick. One of these is poison ivy.
Awesome.
For sure.
So.
So,
I'll give a few more moments for folks to vote.
and while you're voting, what I'm holding up, and you don't have to make this a big screen, is another 3-leaflet leaf that is a maple. So there are several trifoliate maples that are really nice. I wouldn't be holding poison ivy in my office. I'm pretty allergic. So, but there are lots of things out there that have trifoliate leaves that we don't have to be afraid of. And you're correct. The one on the right is poison ivy. Of course, he's not holding the leaf on the right for that particular reason. That leaf on the left is a raspberry. So another one that has a kind of a trifoliate leaf as well. Good. So the last couple of slides in this is to talk a little bit about once you know all of this information, then you can start to key things out. And this is kind of an old technique. I know you can go take a picture with your phone and use an app and figure out maybe what the plant is. And that'll get you started in the right direction. But if you want to make sure that you're right, you're probably going to have to go to some other online resource or a book that often has this thing called dichotomous keys. And ultimately, it's a step-by-step process. So we start off with this is our sample. And if you look at A and AA, are the leaves opposite or are they alternate? In this particular example, the leaves are opposite. So we stay with under the single A. And then B and BB says, are the leaves simple or are they compound? They're simple, so they're pretty easy. So now we're going to C and C, if they're lobed or not lobed. Perfect lobes in here. So we know it's a maple. And we're getting down to that maple fairly quickly just by answering those 3 questions. And this one is a red maple because it has 3 lobes and not more than 3 lobes like other maples. So very quickly, let's work on this last one together. So tell me in the chat, are the leaves opposite or alternate? Susan's starting to see it.
They're just starting to come in.
And then you're also going to tell me if it's opposite or alternate. Are the leaves simple or compound?
All right, so it looks like some people have quickly identified it. Lots of people are saying compound.
Yes.
And they're also saying opposite.
Yes. You're good. So tell me, is it a buckeye, chestnut, or an ash?
Sounds like we've gotten a few votes for buckeye.
And we're good. You just use a dichotomous key. This is a 5-leaflet buckeye. This is a very simple version of a dichotomous key. They can get very elaborate, but they're usually incredibly accurate. So if you have a way to access different dichotomous keys, it's a great way to help you identify different plants. And this is a Ohio buckeye, so a different type of buckeye. And that is it for me. Susan, I think my next slide is questions. So what other questions?
Awesome. So if you can stop your screen share. So I know we got one just recently that asked about an app for identifying plants. I have iNaturalist on my phone.
That's
what
a
do you
good
have
one.
On your phone?
I also have Plant Snap, which is another one. I also have iNaturalist. they're both good, but it's like anything, any app, it all depends on how much you've put into it, right? And what you're kind of coming from. So I still sometimes double check some of those things that it comes up with another couple of resources. So, or books that I have, so just to make sure. Because some things like asters, some things like oaks, there are some really tiny differences that you might actually need to have a microscope or a hand lens to be able to identify it. That even your phone camera can't do a good job with it. So,
Yeah.
yep. And yes, some of these apps are free, so check them out. Some of them are great, and then you'll find the ones that aren't so great.
Right.
Just do a few double checks. Yeah.
So I do have to mention that last week when Donald Lewis was our presenter, there were a number of insects in his background, and then of course you have a number of leaves in your background today, so that's pretty awesome.
I've
Um,
been, having my students when we do kind of webinars online show me what's coloring for fall and where they are. So that's why I
nice.
have leaves, because I
So
always have a few.
so we just talked about a couple apps, and I put those free apps in the chat box. What about dichotomous keys online?
There are a few. Um, I don't know. I don't know. Mostly I've gotten them from books. So I have a few books that's all they are keys. Um, but I know Aaron Style has gotten a couple from online. So I guess if you were just to type in Google dichotomous keys,
And
you could
I put
probably get,
dichotomouskey.edu, and I got one from Oregon State.
sure.
So I'll put that in the chat box.
Okay, that's
Um,
great.
and then we've got a question about the double compound leaf. Can you give us a few more examples of that?
Yeah. So a bipinnately compound leaf like this one, it has one rachis and then another rachis, hence two. It's the name bipinnately compound. Kentucky coffee tree and honey locust are the two most common that we see. Um, there are some tropical plants that I've seen before, but those are usually the two that I come up with. We don't have that many examples of bipinnately compound leaves, which is a good thing.
Okay.
Mhm.
An interesting question came in. So
Uh,
this sounds like a double negative. So you buy a packet of seeds for seedless watermelon.
yes,
And there's an extra package that comes along with a
the
package
pollinator.
of pollinator seeds.
Hmm. Because you're creating a hybrid that is sterile and doesn't produce seed, so you have to have the right parents. Does that make sense? So, and having that pollinizer in there, which does have seed, and usually a few of them, is how you get that fruit to produce, because it's got to cross pollinate. And then the fruit that produces on the seedless type is sterile, so it doesn't produce any seed. But you have to have another flower to cross pollinate it, which is kind of wild.
Right?
So which means if that pollinator watermelon doesn't grow and doesn't produce any fruit, you're probably not going to get any watermelon on the seedless type either. Kind of
Yeah.
funny.
I just love that idea of a packet of seeds for seedless watermelon.
Yes, yes. And it's an interesting how they had to get that. So, yeah.
Right?
Uh-huh.
So going back to the beginning of the presentation when you were talking about imperfect flowers,
Mhm.
one question was just, does that happen by accident, or is this just, that's what it's called, is it's called an imperfect flower?
Right. It's called, well, it depends on who you talk to. Sometimes they're called hermaphrodites as well because they have both sexes on the same thing. That's perfect. Um, we usually use that term with animals and perfection with plants. So imperfect means it's missing something. Um, and yeah, it happened because of evolution, and then this is a way that they could insist on or force that they were cross-pollinated. And yeah, the terms that we come up with are our perceptions of all of that. So some botanists came up with that term about perfect and imperfect. And then the same thing with completeness and incomplete, whether it has all four whorls. So stop and think about this. So if it's imperfect, it's automatically incomplete, but you can have a perfect plant that is still incomplete.
Oh
What
boy.
would be missing?
So if you have a perfect plant that's
Perfect flower
incomplete,
and it's
what is missing?
incomplete. What's missing?
I think we'll see some things come in the chat box.
Yeah. Because if it's imperfect, it's automatically incomplete. But it can be perfect and incomplete. Oh, Cheryl's got something.
Cheryl says sepals,
Yeah.
that it's missing sepals.
It's either missing sepals or petals. So sometimes you do have flowers that don't have any petals. They're called apetalous, or they don't have any sepals.
Is
Which is
that like buzz button?
yeah, like some of those. Yeah, it's kind of weird. So all these flowers have developed based on their habitat and their pollinator, the insect maybe, or wind or whatever that pollinates them. So to be most effective in their environment, which is kind of great for us to enjoy because we get to see a lot of diversity.
So I know you're getting me excited about seeing leaves falling, which usually this time of year we dread the leaves falling. How do you've been involved with this program for a long time? How do Master Gardener volunteers use this type of knowledge that they don't have to be like the walking encyclopedia that knows every plant, but how do they use things like these tools as a volunteer?
Right. I think knowing some of those terms, then when someone says, I have a plant, I want to identify it, even over the phone, you can ask the questions opposite or alternate, or here's a flower, oh, let's take it here, and I can see these different flower parts, I can look this up. My guess is most of your extension offices have access to some of the books, or at least the online keys that you were talking about from Oregon State, so that you can kind of do this kind of, it's not diagnosis, but identification as best that you can. Most good master gardeners also automatically know, well, that's an ash, that's an oak, that's a maple, right? So you have some kind of broad ideas of what it is, and then you're just trying to narrow it down to a different species, and that makes it easy. It's important to be able to have these skills, though, because um, sometimes we have the need or the urgency to identify a plant. A few years ago, I think it was before you were here, Susan, someone called in, a mother called in because her son had eaten the berries off of a shrub. And we very quickly had to try and identify this plant over the phone because her son was sick and very sick and at the hospital. And they were trying to figure out if he'd eaten a poisonous plant. So it was nice because we knew, okay, this is what has berries at this time. She was coherent enough to be able to answer the questions that it had opposite leaves, and we figured out that it was probably a viburnum, which is not poisonous, though very, very bitter, and he didn't like it. So it's a good thing. So to be able to at least have some of those skills to be able to get some rudimentary identification going. And then
Yeah,
there's others to back you up if we need to.
and I like that you shared poison ivy. That's an important one to know.
Always know poison
So
ivy.
what are some of the tips? I saw some people in the chat box, they talked about the mitten shape of the poison ivy. What are some other things to look for with poison ivy?
So it's a 3-leaflet leaf, and it does have these kind of slight lobes or mittens. It's almost always a lighter green during the growing season, and it truly is a vine. So, and the vine itself has these very hairy-like roots that affix to things. So that's kind of the things that you're looking for. And it has a nice fall color. So it's another thing that you can look for. All parts of poison ivy can cause the rash, the roots, the leaves, the flowers, and even the ash from burning it can cause a rash. And the oils that create the rash can last for over a year. So it's a good one to make sure you know how to identify. And
Hide those
it can be
hiking
done.
boots.
Yes, so your hiking boots, if you're walking through poison ivy, wash them.
Yeah.
Yep. Hmm.
So, so some houseplants we want to fruit, and we might need to give them a little bit of help because there isn't a pollinator. So someone said that they've got a Meyer lemon,
Oh,
and
nice.
that somebody said take a Q-tip and do some help it pollinate.
Yeah, be the bee. So go from one flower to the next with the Q-tip. Yeah, ideally you want to be the bee. And some plants, you can do that with the flowers that you have just on that plant, like cherries are self-fertile. So there's, the pollen moves around by bees on the plant. And other plants, you have to have, the dioecious plants, you have to have another plant nearby. So yeah, it's great. So be the bee. And you can do this, you can be the bee for your squash and watermelon too. But usually you have the free services of certain insects, which is kind
Right?
of nice. Hmm.
And it looks like at least one person has already used what you told them in the past 58 minutes to identify that there's a walnut growing in their yard.
Excellent.
Maybe a squirrel planted it. So I
That's
know.
great. So now can we do the last polling question?
Yeah,
So,
absolutely. Let me pull
so we
that up.
can see, yes. So it's always great that you know that you have a walnut. So I'm going to ask you again now, how comfortable are you with identifying plants?
Hey, people
Oh,
are saying I can do this.
you can do this.
I'm not going to close the poll yet, but 0% have said not me. Um, cool. I'm gonna close the poll in just a moment. It looks like almost everybody has voted. So let's share those results. Yeah, people feel confident,
Well, and that's the purpose of this. It's not to give you every bit of information. It's enough confidence that gets you started, so that you can go out there and find more resources or find others that can help you, so that you can, at least you can do this and you can get it right most of the time.
right? I know last week one of the questions was, do I have to know everything? And this is just such a good reminder, Cindy, that Master Gardener volunteers don't have to know it all, but know where to find things to help in their community.
Right.
And with that, any last words before we wrap up?
Have fun with the volunteering. I know this is a really weird year, but you know what? Trees, fall is still happening, winter's still happening, spring will still happen, and you can get out there and identify plants, and you don't have to be in a large group to do it. So you can still have fun with the Master Gardener program, regardless. So enjoy the seasons.
Thank you so much, Cindy.
Thanks.
Bye, everybody.